Good morning, everybody. I'm Lisa Stone of Parenting Aces, and I am joined this morning by Rob Weintraub, who has written a new book called The Divine Miss Marble. I have put the link in the comments, and we'll flash it on the screen as we chat today, Rob. But welcome from Decatur, Georgia.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so you and I found out we're Atlanta neighbors, but I'm now in California, but you were in California for a while. We've got all sorts of path crossing things happening in our lives.
Yeah, we're neighbors and multiple planes, apparently.
Yeah.
It worked out well. And the subject of the book, Alice Marble, was quite the California golden girl. She was a real Californian from top to bottom of the state. So it worked out that we would talk and you would be in California.
Yeah. Yeah, small world. So I want to just quickly, when I have new guests, I'd like to just give them an opportunity to talk about their interaction with tennis. And as you and I were talking before we went live, you do play.
Yeah.
Did you play as a kid?
Not really. I did the classic basketball, and I grew up in the Northeast, so I played a lot of hockey and football and everything else. And then I really didn't get into it until I moved to Atlanta. Atlanta has a huge tennis scene,
Yeah.
no doubt know. The ALTA, Atlanta Lawn Tennis Association, is massive. People play doubles here all the time. And my then wife, now my ex-wife, got me really into it, and we played a lot, throughout the years. And I still like to play. I don't get to play as much for the usual reasons: advancing age, declining joints, lack of time, usual. But I do enjoy it greatly, and in a different world, I would have been a lot better at it. Never came naturally to me because I didn't grow up playing it, but I really
Right.
liked it. And like Alice, I was serving volley was all I had basically. If it was the ground strokes, I was nowhere.
So, what drew you to Alice Marble? And maybe for our listeners who aren't familiar with her, and admittedly, I am new to the Alice Marble story really in the past year and a half or so as I've started to learn more of the history of our sport. But what drew you to her?
Well, I'll say it's easily forgivable from your standpoint because even historians of the sport, she's not really that familiar to most people. She's kind of lost to history, which is one of the reasons I wanted to write about her. And I didn't know that much about her. I really knew nothing except for, I was dimly aware of the name as just a long ago champion like a Helen Wills Moody or a Suzanne Lalonde, one of these great names from the past, but that's all I knew. And I was just perusing through a used bookstore, as I am wont to do, and I saw her memoir, her second memoir that she wrote right before she died, and it had all these incredible stories and really just an amazing life. And as an author, always looking to write about things like that, I took notice. And the more I dug into her life, it was very apparent to me that this was someone who required the 20,000 foot outsider or biographer treatment. Somebody who could separate fact from fiction, somebody who could put into context really all of her achievements and all of the things she did and claimed to do, and kind of take the path of somebody who was gonna, really give her life a real, thorough once over and put it into print. And that person turned out to be me. I didn't really set out to write about her specifically, but once I discovered her story, I thought I had to.
Yeah. And your book, The Divine Miss Marble, starts out with a James Bond-esque scene, a car chase on a mountain road and gunshots. And then you kind of leave us hanging as you start to tell Alice's story and the story of her parents and her brothers and her sister and, their move to California and subsequent childhood. I mean, Alice is one of these women that as you learn more about her, you just think, my gosh, how come her story hasn't been told? She is such an amazing role model for young girls coming up in sports, coming up who are interested in politics, coming up who are interested in writing, singing, acting, public speaking. I mean, this woman was in every realm you can imagine.
Yeah, she really did it all. And what attracted me really the most when I started to dig into her story and see all the obstacles that she overcame, and just all the valleys that she rose through in her life. Her mental toughness was just astounding. I mean, we're kind of it's commonplace in sports and with athletics to kind of praise an athlete's mental toughness for coming through in the clutch or whatever. But
Right.
Alice, I mean, she really willed herself to where she was, and then willed her her way past a series of obstacles and really blows to the body that would have knocked down most athletes, and she came back every time. And that held true even when she was long past her tennis career. She battled health problems all her life. She was not remunerated financially for her great tennis accomplishments because she played in the amateur era. So she never made a dime for winning Wimbledon or the U.S. national championships, what we call the U.S. Open now.
Mm-hmm.
She came from poverty and wound up back in poverty for a good portion of her life after tennis. And despite all these problems that she had, she always, came roaring back. And I really admired her for that. And it carried me through some of the points where I was a little bit dubious about her and her story for what she told. She, not to give too much away, but I mean, there are some things that I certainly couldn't prove and I couldn't disprove, but there's things that you would have to say were embellished in her story, in her memoir that she wrote before she died, anyway. But the things that are definitely true about her and that were easily proven are extraordinary in their own right.
Yeah.
And like you say, she succeeded and excelled in so many fields other than tennis. Really astounding. I mean, not just she was a nightclub singer, and she was a fashion designer. She was the first woman to really wear shorts on the tennis court, in and of itself, sort of a trailblazer in that regard. And an exceptional writer, which as another writer, I certainly appealed to me.
Mm-hmm.
An orator, as you said. I mean, she relentlessly traveled the country for 2 decades almost, giving speeches about herself and about the will to win, as she put it, and how to live a better life. During the war, she was, tasked with kind of improving women's physical fitness and talking about physical fitness to a nation of women who were not ready for war, theoretically.
And by war, we're talking World War II, just to
yeah.
clarify for people.
Yes, yeah. Mention that, yeah.
Yeah.
Her career was, at its zenith. I mean, she was really not just the best tennis player, but one of the foremost athletes in the entire country in 1939, and then into 1940. We think of World War II starting in 1941, but of course in Europe it started in 1939. She won Wimbledon in 39, and then there was no more Wimbledon after that.
Right.
7 more years. So she was really denied what we would think of as many more major championships. She won the 1940 U.S. Nationals, and then they didn't play that again either. So, that's a large part of the reason why her name is not, immediately recognizable to so many people as it would be if she had, piled up another 10 major titles, including doubles, or 15, which she easily was capable of.
And mixed doubles. Mixed doubles. I mean, the woman was winning everything at her peak.
She really was a dominant player, and even more so in doubles, perhaps, than in singles, which is, a testament to her abilities. And she was a serve and volley master. I mean, that's where really the tennis can be divided into a before and after period, where before Alice, women players mostly played from the baseline. They wore these calf-length skirts. It was
right.
Dainty, but it was, a little bit less sort of
athletic.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And Alice was exactly the opposite. She came along with a devastating serve that is still considered one of the greatest of all time. Volley, play, the serve and volley game that was second to none, and just overwhelming athleticism that, changed the game entirely and was overwhelming to her opposition, surely, and allowed her to be successful in, as you say, not just singles, but especially in doubles, where she was just a whirlwind and could play with all different levels of partners and still be successful. So she was really an extraordinary player, and as we were saying, certainly an extraordinary woman off the court as well.
Yeah. And I know you didn't time this, you couldn't have timed this, but Alice's work in terms of diversity and inclusion that's one of the things that really jumped out at me as I was reading your book. And given the time we're all living in right now, with the Black Lives Matter movement really taking hold and, somewhat dominating fighting with space with COVID-19, of course, but somewhat dominating the global conversation right now. I thought the fact that Alice Marble was someone who fought for inclusion, fought for her comrades of color to be welcomed into the biggest tennis events in the country and in the world was pretty spectacular, because she was, I mean, not just a trailblazer in terms of fashion on the tennis court, but also in terms of what tennis really looked like as a sport, as an organization, and often butted heads with the head of the then USLTA, which morphed into the USTA, which felt very familiar to me. So maybe can you share with us a little bit about her work around diversity and inclusion, not just on a racial perspective, but also sexual orientation?
Yeah, no question. I mean, a key element to know, which obviously the audience probably doesn't know at the moment, is that Alice was bisexual. This is somebody who carried on affairs with both men and women, sometimes controversially, sometimes hidden, especially in the times that she was living in. The homosexual affairs had to be buried, not just because of the blowback to her personal, sort of burgeoning empire, if you will. Alice Marble Incorporated would have disappeared overnight if she had been found out to be a publicly lesbian. But certainly, just in general, in the 1930s especially, there was a huge blowback against homosexual behavior in the country at large. And that continued, sadly, into the 40s and later on, even today, obviously. So
Right.
that was something that she obviously fought about in a much more quieter way, and in a very public and brave way. She championed the cause of African American inclusion, which was certainly not something that people did at the time. I don't care who you were, a great athlete or otherwise. During World War II, she was playing, mixed doubles in integrated settings in Harlem, New York, which is, just beyond the pale of any other, certainly no Golden Girl athlete who is looked upon as one of America's sweethearts was doing anything of the sort like that. And when she played one of these matches in New York, one of the kids at the time watching in the stands was a woman named Althea Gibson, who has a much more familiar name to tennis fans than Alice does. Althea then became, of course, a great player as she grew up, and was certainly good enough to play at the national level, but was denied the possibility of playing because of the color of her skin. And Alice very publicly used her, still at that point, public, what's the word? Bully pulpit, I guess you'd say. She had a column in the USLTA kind of House Organ, and she wrote a series of essays saying you cannot exclude Althea Gibson from playing if she is good enough to play at the national level just because she's black. And that was extraordinary, and she got a lot of blowback for that, but also was very successful at doing it. And I don't want to say single-handedly, but really provided kind of a decisive push to getting Althea accepted in 1950 into the U.S. Open, U.S. Nationals, and being allowed to play. And from there, Althea's greatness obviously shone through. And soon enough, she was a multiple major winner and a Hall of Famer in her own right. And she never forgot Alice and the boost that she gave her right at the beginning of her career. So to sum up, I mean, you're talking about somebody who not just was an extraordinary woman in all the ways we've talked about already, which is, at the forefront of so many different, professions / places to show her excellence, but also somebody who fought for people who were left behind, fought continually throughout her life for people who were less fortunate than her, and never forgot where she came from. And that's pretty much all you can ask for a heroic figure like that.
Absolutely. And you write a lot about the birth of the ATA, which is the American Tennis Association, which historically was the Black Tennis Association because African Americans, as you just said, were not allowed to play in USLTA events. And so the ATA is one of, it may be the oldest professional sports organization in the world.
Yeah,
and not coincidentally, sort of coincidentally, the ATA has been putting on a series of online lectures all week this week, which I've been tuning into. And they've been really interesting, touching on the history of Blacks in tennis, but also, talking about historically Black colleges and universities, and then more generic topics such as just tennis development in general, because junior development's junior development. The color of your skin, doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that was something I really didn't know that much about, to be totally honest. The ATA, again, it was sort of a dimly noted footnote to sort of sports history. I consider myself a sports historian. I've written about baseball history in a couple books extensively, and certainly other sports as well. But I knew tennis history to a degree, but nothing about the ATA. And to see the depth and the sort of high level and quality of not just play, but as you say, sort of community involvement involved in the ATA through many decades, long before, during the Jim Crow period and even before, was pretty astounding to me. And it was, sort of equivalent to what you saw in baseball at the time, which was its own separate Negro leagues, what they called in baseball. And here you had the ATA, kind of providing a separate, unequal platform for African American players to perform. But of course, it was all, it was never anything that was worthwhile, because it was just not worthwhile. It's not the right word, but just, until the races got together and played on an even playing field as they did in baseball in 1947, you wound up just having tainted, basically, championships. People, once everybody was included, then you really saw the true champions like Althea Gibson shine forth. And
Arthur Ashe is came through ATA.
Yeah.
Right.
And
that was
players who we never really heard of either, which is
right.
Whom I managed to bring out at least a little bit in the book. I didn't want to get too much off on a tangent, but it was really the depth and quality of the play, as I say, and the level of attention that, and just the level of quality professionalism in the ATA. Actually, the ATA was much better run than the USLTA was for many years at that time. So, that contrast also shone through.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I think might be of interest to the parents watching is the fact that Alice Marble started as a baseball player.
Yeah.
I mean, she was a tomboy. She had big brothers, and she spent a lot of time on the baseball field well before she picked up a tennis racket for the first time. And I thought it was so interesting, even as she got into coaching once her own tennis career was winding down, that she would have her students go out and throw baseballs. She would teach them how to swing a bat and do some of the activities that now we look at that and we call it cross training, right? Or developing the whole athlete. But I'm assuming back in Alice's day, that was a unique approach to training for a sport like tennis.
Yeah, no question. And, what worked to personal level to me was that, I'm a parent, you're a parent. My kids play a lot of different sports. And you see so often now, unfortunately, you see what's sort of too much concentration on a single sport for kids. Whereas multi-sport athletes, it's been proven time and again to look at the professional ranks of any sport you care to look at. The ones who really thrive and enjoy what they're doing the most are the ones who play all kinds of different sports. And that was certainly Alice's background. As you say, she was a fantastic baseball player, one of the best in San Francisco, where she grew up, and that's boy or girl. She was kind of plucked from the stands and taken as the mascot slash, pregame warm up, kind of entertainment for the San Francisco Seals, who were the AAA franchise in San Francisco and really the big thing baseball wise in California before baseball expanded west. You have to realize this is long before there was Major League Baseball in California. So she was one of the biggest stars in the city, even, as you say, even before she picked up a racket. People knew who she was. She was Alice Marble, the baseball playing girl. I mean, that was, a big thing. She was in baseball throwing contests and, kind of had as a second home Seals Park in San Francisco, where the baseball team played. And she also was a very good basketball player and track athlete. I mean, she was an incredible natural athlete, everything she did. And this holds true later in life as well. When she picked up a golf club for the first time, she was a scratch golfer. I mean, this is somebody who was incredibly gifted, but also worked incredibly hard at her craft. And when she wound up playing tennis, her natural athleticism carried her to the very top right off the bat. She didn't have the finer tuning that she would then require, and that's where her coach, Eleanor Teachten, came in. We'll get to her later, I'm assuming, but
Yeah.
she definitely, was able to play at the very highest level just based on her pure athleticism and based on the fact that, as you say, baseball had given her sort of a swing and a balance and a natural approach to the game that really carried over very well to tennis. And yeah, I think people who have kids now learning both sports could do well to see the similarities between the two and use both games in their training for their children. I know my son, big baseball player, and he loves to pick up a tennis racket and club it like a baseball. And he plays pretty well. He needs a little refinement, no doubt, as do we all. But you can see the similarities for sure between the sports.
Yeah, yeah. And another thing that I found so interesting about her start in the sport was, unlike most kids who were introduced to tennis in her time, and even still today, she did not come through the country club setting. Her family did not have means. Her father died when she was young. Her mother was a single mom supporting the family. The kids started working very young to help keep the family afloat in San Francisco. And Alice came up at a public park in San Francisco, and by whatever happened in the universe, stars aligning and all of that, wound up living this life among the wealthiest people in the world, the most famous celebrities in the world. It was just mind-boggling to read that part of her story.
Yeah, she grew up playing in Golden Gate Park, which is obviously still a very famous place to go to San Francisco. And this is before the Golden Gate Bridge was even built, so you can imagine the park was there, but no bridge towering over it. Weather-beaten courts, hard, cement. The wind would blow the balls in the mist. It was very difficult to play there, as you allude to, and it was really an advantage for her as it turned out because she was so good and wound up playing in these hard scrabble conditions. When she went up against the majority of her opposition at the elite level, all of whom, most of them, I wouldn't say all, but most of them had come up, through means, learning in country clubs, private coaching, elite settings, everything kind of, you know, what we call helicopter parenting today. Everything was smoothed out for them a little bit in front of them, snowplow parenting, I guess it is.
Yeah.
Alice did not have that in any stretch. And, that kind of break it, do willing yourself to the top mentality really came to help her quite a bit when she reached the elite level and came up against a lot of players who didn't have her mental toughness, as I alluded to before. And yeah, the fact that she wound up being, kind of hobnobbing, she had a very Zelig like existence. I mean, she wound up standing shoulder to shoulder with some of the bold faced names of the era. A lot of these names happen to be great tennis players or tennis fans themselves, which is why they liked Alice. Part of it was through her coach, Eleanor Teachten, who we mentioned earlier, who had a similar background to Alice in that she willed herself out of the San Francisco streets, not coming from money. She kind of talked her way into becoming the tennis pro at the Beverly Hills Hotel, and through that wound up coaching, bold-faced names of old Hollywood who loved tennis: Marlene Dietrich, Errol Flynn, particularly Clark Gable and Carole Lombard, who were eventually married and who were great friends with Alice. And also because of the fact that Alice didn't make any money and at tennis, kind of had to be subsidized throughout. That was something that kind of the millionaires, the swells of the era enjoyed doing, especially for a great personality and a winning kind of champion like Alice, who everybody liked upon meeting almost immediately. She had that kind of all-American girl next door, in quotes, the golden girl personality, the sunny Californian, and the likes of William Randolph Hearst and the DuPont family and many, many other millionaires at the time really took to her, and they would, bring her to their mansions where she would live for a month before the U.S. Nationals, and she would go to England and live on these palatial estates before Wimbledon. This, despite the fact that she didn't actually have enough money of her own to really even open a bank account. I mean, we're talking about a real, she lived this jet set almost lifestyle, and yet at the same time, the dichotomy was she was very poor and was in hock actually to Eleanor Teachten, who had paid her bills almost completely since taking her on as a student. So she lived. It was a fascinating kind of double-edged life, and that I think led to a lot of what happened with her later in life, and perhaps some of the feelings she may have had as her life wound down of never not only being fully appreciated and fully remunerated for her achievements, but and she always gave the people what they wanted. That was her thing. She was a great audience pleaser, and I think that kind of had its kind of fruition, or starting, I should say, its genesis by hanging around with all these Hollywood types and seeing how they operated with the public, and she really studied that very closely.
Yeah, I mean, was amazing at building her own relationships too and creating opportunities for herself to earn some money and try and repay Teach for all of the years that Tennant, supported her, as you said. Let's talk about Eleanor Teach Tennant a minute. I knew her name prior to picking up your book, but I didn't know much about her at all beyond her name, and found her story equally fascinating to Alice's.
Yeah, you do more than I did. I didn't even know the name. I mean, I really knew nothing about her. And as I came to discover, she's almost as worthy of a biography as Alice. I mean, another extraordinary person, as I said, willed her way out of San Francisco poverty. There her family, she came up during the 1906 earthquake, and the city was leveled around her. She stole a tennis racket from a boarder who was living in her house and kind of became interested in the sport that way, and willed herself not quite to the heights that Alice did in terms of tennis greatness on her singles sort of level, but was certainly a well-regarded player. And then, as I said, talked her way into becoming a tennis pro and taught some of the biggest names in Hollywood and around. And she also taught these mass clinics where she was really gifted at being able to get across simple precepts of the game and have students play the way she wanted them to play. She was also what we would consider today, sort of the hard line kind of Lombardi-esque, Vince Lombardi, Bill Belichick, these names that we all know from football and male sports, team sports, is this kind of psychological mastermind and somebody who managed to get the best out of their players no matter what. She was doing these things, with Alice back in the 30s. I mean, they had a real, Alice was like an Eliza Doolittle kind of figure for Eleanor. Eleanor's great dream was to find somebody of limited means like her, like the way she grew up, and then kind of take that talented lump of clay and really mold it into not just a champion tennis player, but a person who could mix with the blue bloods and the Hollywood elite that she was mixing with. And Alice fulfilled all of those dreams for her. And of course, they had a very, very close relationship.
Yeah, which is kind of like, and I don't know if it's because I haven't finished the book yet, but it's still unclear.
Well, that's the thing, right? They never, said, came out and said, even in private, they never came out and said openly, we are lovers, despite the fact that they, for a period of time, were joined at the hip. I mean, they were basically together and lived together for almost a full decade of the 30s. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that was in part because Eleanor, gave a lot for Alice. I mean, she really gave up herself. Alice this is a part of her story we haven't even talked about yet, but right at the brink of her kind of pushing through to the very top of the sport, Alice was then collapsed on a court in Paris at the Roland Garros Stadium, where the French Open is held now, during an exhibition leading up to Wimbledon, and was out of the sport. She got a diagnosis of tuberculosis, which at the time was not just almost a death sentence, but certainly her tennis career was basically finished. And she was 21 and just about to break through and be, perhaps a great champion. And for 2 years, she was out of the sport. And Eleanor not only supported her financially this entire time and paid her doctor bills when Alice was laid up in a sanitarium for months at a time, getting fat and doughy and just losing all, zest for life. Eleanor basically broke her out of the place and said, enough of this nonsense. You're coming with me. We're going to start a regimen. You're getting back to the top. I don't care what I have to do. And again, an extraordinary example of the willpower and mental toughness, not only of Alice, but of Eleanor. The two of them did it. It was considered, when Alice then won in 1936, the U.S. National Championship, an extraordinary comeback story, the likes that had seldom been seen at that time in American sports. And Alice was deluged with letters and telegrams from people, not just congratulating her, but asking her, how did you do it?
How did you do it? Right.
Yeah. I have problems in my own life. How can I overcome these things? She had answers for them, to a certain degree, but obviously what the real answer was her incredible willpower and mental toughness, and having a coach who believed in her and refused to let her give up as well.
Mm-hmm.
And the story there together, what they did together, is really the heart of what I think is the tale of Alice and her success. And when they came apart for various factors during the war, when Alice's career was basically over on the court, it was appropriately operatic and dramatic, as you would expect to have between two, and I use the word lovers sort of in a broader sense, forgetting about the sort of titillating physical idea of the two of them together, which I think is unquestionable that they had at least a brief relationship that way, but they had really had a much stronger bond even than that. It wasn't like just some physical relationship that peters out. I mean, the two of them were as close as they possibly could, and they shared almost a single mindset throughout a long period of time, and both learned from each other greatly. And Alice especially learned from Eleanor. And it's really, as you alluded to at the beginning, not just an amazing tale, but really an unknown tale of kind of coach athlete relationship that you hear so many stories, especially in tennis, about how that goes so wrong so often,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's a parent involved or just a coach and the player don't see eye to eye, or there's various other factors involved. Here is an incredible success story that went on for almost a full decade, and it surprised me. I knew nothing about any of it before I started the research.
Yeah. And, one thing we didn't mention is the fact, well, we said at the beginning that Alice's father passed away pretty young. And so Alice's mom was a single mom raising these children. But then the mom got cancer and also passed away when Alice was in her early 20s.
20s, yeah.
Yeah.
Can't remember the exact age, 23, 24, somewhere in there.
So she also lost her mom. So having this strong female coach in her corner, I would assume was really instrumental in helping her kind of stay on her path to the greatness that she achieved in all these different areas of her life. But, as you're talking about her recovery from her illness, I mean, you also write about car accidents that injured her and other illnesses that she contracted over the years. So, I mean, it was a constant battle against her body to stay healthy and stay out on the circuit. She developed these very specific eating rituals, exercise rituals, even meditation and mindfulness. So you don't use those words in the book, but as I was reading your description, it's certainly what she was doing. And during World War II, was contracted by the government to share that information, as you spoke about earlier, on a national scale, which I just thought was fascinating because, of course, most of us have heard of Jack LaLanne as being the fitness guru, right? But who ever heard of Alice Marble in that capacity? And it seems to me that she played an enormous role in helping to educate the American female public about the importance of self-care and fitness.
No question. I mean, she was like Jack LaLanne, but if you also had this sort of mental element thrown in, I feel like Jack LaLanne is mostly just physical, training and regimens, and Alice was all for that, but also very much for the physical, the mental, I should say, will. She even titled her speeches "The Will to Win," which sort of dovetailed with her comeback in 1936. But it really was more like a life coach and a life approach that
Mm-hmm.
she really worked hard on, and as I mentioned earlier, I think was just relentless in delivering. I mean, this is another factor that you have to understand in context, but I mean, she was driving and traveling by herself constantly, months at a time, throughout the country in the late 40s and during the war, and then after the war in the 40s and 50s, by herself as a woman, driving hundreds of thousands of miles at times. I mean, she was, as you mentioned, got into a lot of car wrecks as well, but kind of statistically makes sense because of the amount of driving time, the amount of mileage
Yeah.
she just put in. And she was giving these speeches sometimes, in a lot of colleges, a lot of women's colleges, historically black colleges, oftentimes, in out of the way places in the South and in the West, places stars of her magnitude never went to. And it was all to it kind of pass along what she thought it was critical, which was that not only is it important for your mind, for your body to be kept in fine fiddle, but your mind as well. Get a ton of sleep, and have a positive attitude. Think about what you want to do before achieving it, and don't let anything stand in your way until you get to your goal and reach your goal. And this is pretty. That's pretty progressive stuff for the 40s and 50s for a woman to be saying that and be just traveling around basically on her own. And she learned a lot of that from Eleanor, no question about it. I mean, Eleanor kind of filled her head with this and originally and designed a regimen for her to follow. But and Alice, as Eleanor would say, was an incredible student of hers in that she took to all these things. If there was any smallest thing, the number of eggs she ate for breakfast or the number of times she would skip rope before taking the court or whatever, anything that she saw would help her achieve her goals on and off the court, she took to and never looked back and never ever thought twice about doing anything else. So uh, the two of them were, kind of dual responsibility at the beginning, but Alice unquestionably was, you know, very much ahead of her time in, as you said, alluded to, kind of combining the sort of holistic approach of mind married to body and having it work as a way to achieve your goals, not just being a top flight tennis player, but anything. And that certainly was the case during the war, and really took flight even more so afterward.
And I mean, just so our viewers kind of understand the context of all of this, the reason that the government kind of contracted with Alice to make these talks around the country was because the men were all off fighting the war, and the women were left here in the States to take over the jobs that the men were vacating to go fight. So a lot of those jobs were physical in nature and required physical strength, physical endurance, stamina, and the mental, stick-to-itiveness to push through when things got difficult, because work conditions during the 30s and 40s, could be brutal.
Right. You're talking about a populace that had just and was still really in the throes of the Depression. I mean,
Right.
one of the things that you sort of see that was striking to me was just how much Alice and Eleanor sort of skated through the Depression almost on dint of their, celebrity in particular. But obviously, the rest of the country did not. And when Alice,
but they were already broke, so
yeah,
like,
in a way they had nothing to lose. Exactly. It was sort of like,
yeah,
that was a reason they took a lot of the, I don't want to say chances, but they sort of had that attitude of, we got nothing to lose. Let's just,
right.
Let's ask, and what's the worst that can happen? And that happened throughout their lives, in not just tennis settings, but in all kinds of settings. Alice got to do a lot of things because she asked to do them or just did them without asking permission, and that's sort of what's the old line about how,
better to ask forgiveness.
That and polite women don't change history. Things like, she just did things and never really questioned herself. She said, I'm doing it, and if I turn out to be wrong about something, then I turn out to be wrong. I don't care about that so much, but I don't want to be stopped from, trying something new, like singing as a nightclub singer.
Right.
For example, getting up on stage when she had never done that before and making her debut, in front of New York society in this incredible settings. I mean, just the thought of that paralyzes me. And she's just like, I'm doing it, of course.
Yeah, she was brave.
I screw up. What the heck? But
right.
To get back to your point about the setting and the war, there was sort of, again, as I said, we don't really think of it this way here in this country, because for us, the war didn't really start until Pearl Harbor at the end of 1941. But, in 1939, and especially 1940 and into 1941, a lot of the country was sort of on a war footing without being declared as being in war. And certainly at the highest points of government, they knew that a war was coming. And Alice knew a war was coming, a large part because she traveled to England often to play at Wimbledon, was told a war's happening, and then the war broke out in Europe. And she was kind of appalled by what she saw as American sort of soft style life. And this is during the Depression, and she thought
right.
Americans were too soft, you can imagine. Compared to her, most of them were. So she was, in a unique situation. That's why she was sort of tapped to be the person to really speak to women and demonstrate to them how playing sports and being active you didn't have to. She wasn't advocating to get out on the tennis court and play 3 sets of tennis. She was advocating for walking and for eating properly, getting good sleep, getting in a little exercise where you could, that kind of stuff. And then when the war happened, it sort of was almost she was made redundant when U.S. went into war because everybody sort of took that attitude that she was pushing so hard and often was running up against brick walls. And then everybody overnight sort of said, "Oh yeah, she was right all along. Let's do
Yeah.
it." And she was sort of made redundant. She wound up giving the same sort of advice and touring and talking with and playing tennis for the troops, male and female, mainly female, but there were still a lot of training bases where there were a lot of male troops here in the States and also in the Caribbean, where she wound up spending a lot of time as well. So she was doing this relentless travel, as I mentioned, and talks and everything about it. Even when she wasn't in the official capacity of the government, she was still doing it just because she thought it was the right thing to do, and it had been successful for her. And I guess we won the war, so it worked out okay.
And she traveled to the bases with her doubles partner, who was British, right?
Yeah, that's right. And somebody who also had much more of an idea of what was going on, quote unquote, in the real world, in Europe, than most Americans did. Most Americans were sort of like, well, it's another European war, and if we have to get into it at the end to bail them out like we did in World War I, all right, we'll do that then. But obviously the war became much more of a global conflagration and much more severe to the average American than most people thought it would in 1940 and 1941. And being somebody who basically kind of was one of the last faces that a lot of these kids saw before they went to overseas, to Europe and the Pacific. She was right there, both in New York and traveling to all these bases. She was very upfront about spending time with kids who were about, kids is a little bit loose, but a lot of them were soldiers and flyers and sailors who were about to ship out. She spent a great deal of time with those people and sort of was like in a not just, put aside her will to win speech and her sort of hard way of looking at life as a disciplinary, and was very comforting to these people and to these guys, and kind of was like, remember me when you are off fighting the Hun or the Japanese. She put herself in that role too, and was very successful at that also. So she was able to take on sort of multiple personalities as the setting dictated, and that, as we said earlier, she was very good at sort of looking around and seeing what kind of personality was required for her to put on at any given moment. And I don't mean that to sound as like a false way. She was just, she was very adept at mirroring what the person she was with.
Reading the room. She read the room.
Yeah, she read the room and was very comfortable with all manner of people. And she was certainly very comfortable with people who grew up with no means, as she did. That was the thing. She was able to get by with all these millionaires and Hollywood celebrities because of her personality, but really she was most comfortable with, kind of the average Joe or Josephine, and made them feel like they were, on top of the world and were fighting the war single-handedly. So that was a really impressive part of her personality as well.
What makes it even more impressive, Rob, is the fact that as a young tennis player, when she was just starting up, she had a temper. And I mean, she was feisty. She was throwing rackets and, not behaving in the most ladylike, sportsmanlike fashion. And like Roger Federer, we've heard stories of him as a young child, of how feisty he was. And now we watch him and we're, in awe of his grace on the tennis court. Alice developed that as well and took that, into life off the court, which, you've been talking about.
Right. And it's funny you mentioned Federer, because somebody asked me just not that long ago, who in the modern era would I compare Alice to? And of course, the obvious answer is, sort of part Martina Navratilova, part Chris Evert, that she's sort of the, child between the two. She had the blonde, all-American, kind of grace and style of Chris Evert, the all-encompassing athleticism and ferocious play of Martina. But really, she reminded me most of, as you say, Roger Federer, not just because of what you said, kind of overcoming her tennis brat kind of, tempestuousness when she was young to become a real graceful player and friendly, one of the most popular players really of her era. among her other players, even
Mm-hmm.
not just in the general public, but other players really adored her, and I think Federer encompasses that. And also, she was a real fashion plate, which Roger,
Yeah.
to varying degrees, perhaps depending on your taste. But yeah, she not only was she sought after as a model for many fashion designers to wear clothes, but she was a fashion designer herself, and not only made tennis clothes, but everyday clothes, and during the war in particular, designed shoes for the people,
Right.
the women who were spending their days, in the factories and on their feet suddenly, and she designed comfortable wear for these newly employed women, and did all kinds of other interesting fashion designs that she just drew up and made herself. Another example of her just saying, "I'm going to do this. I have an interest in it, and if somebody tells me they're not interested, then fine, but I'm not going to let it stop me." And I think you see a little bit of that in Federer as well. So it's great that you mentioned Roger, because I really thought of him a lot when I was writing the book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. And, another thing that Alice got involved in, I mean, I'm telling you, this woman is like the definition of Renaissance woman, right?
Yeah.
I mean, whatever she wanted to tackle, she tackled at the highest levels.
Right.
She got involved in the women's movement in the States, but got a little disillusioned with that too. And I just finished watching the series Mrs. America, and I don't know if anybody else has watched it, but it was really interesting because I was a little kid when all of this was going on, but I have some memories, especially of the personalities involved. Didn't realize there was a tennis connection there, but there's Alice Marble.
Yeah. Well, and again, this is the part of her personality that was interesting enough to me, which is that in parts of her, we have talked about how progressive she was, and she's certainly fighting for women's rights throughout her career, obviously gay rights and African American rights, but she had a streak of conservatism too, which was not
right.
common. Yeah.
That was so bizarre to me too, to read that.
And I'm not sure if it's you see this a lot in California. I associate it a lot with California, funnily enough, which is that there's this, kind of, we associate California with being this, incredible liberal place where everything goes. But there's historically certainly a strong streak of conservatism coming out of California, and obviously you have Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan coming out of California. I mean, this is not.
I live in Richard Nixon country. Yeah, I live in Orange County, so
the heartland of it, exactly.
Yeah.
She spent a lot of time there, and in Palm Springs, which is another place,
yeah,
desert area, which is also a font of that. And so she had a bit of a mix of the two. I mean, she was certainly, again, it was part of her personality where she believed what she believed, and a lot of it was sort of informed by the anti-communist era, the Cold War, and what she thought of as kind of this struggle between these two, dichotomous ideologies, but also what we were talking about earlier, which was, she willed herself up from the bootstraps, kind of this conservative, for what you make of it, not to get into a political discussion, but that's something you hear from the conservative, sort of way of thinking a lot is, do it yourself. And that's what she did. And whether, it certainly didn't necessarily jibe with a lot of the things that she thought about in terms of equality, but that aspect of her personality really did. And it was very interesting to see, the two sort of sides of those come together and clash at times. And then later in life, she kind of went the other way and saw what sort of the conservative movement had done to many of her friends in the less advantaged communities, and kind of had a late in life difference of opinion with many of her former conservative friends, and changed a little bit politically. But it just made her personality even more interesting to me, and it was another surprise. Like I said often about her, you peel the onion layer away, and there's something even more fascinating just a little bit below the surface. And this is another example of that.
Right. It's interesting because one of the things that I talk about a lot on the Parenting Aces platform, whether it's articles or podcasts or whatever, is the life lessons that tennis can offer to kids who get involved in the sport, but also the opportunities that tennis can offer after your competitive career is finished. And to me, she is the embodiment of that. right? She learned these lessons through competing in tennis, through coming up, as an underprivileged child in a single parent home, not having means, and use tennis as a tool to improve her life and then to improve the lives of others.
Right. Yeah, no question. And even what we touched on earlier, is sort of the way she was so good at doubles and, was able to defer to other partners and then take the lead when necessary. And, when she first started playing, she had trouble doing that, and then, as her career went on, that became a particular strength in her game. And it's all part of the same sort of rubric that you mentioned, which was that she took the lessons that she learned playing tennis and what tennis brought to her, and athletics in general too, not just tennis, but mainly tennis, obviously. And applied them to her life and applied them to making people's lives better. I mean, what else can you ask for from a champion? And again, I think this is the Roger Federer connection a little bit too. I saw some of that too. He's somebody who certainly gives of his time and
yes,
and his money
and his money, yeah.
Right. So I mean, what else can you ask for from a great champion other than to not kind of kick the ladder down and just say I made it and nobody else can, but to help other people and get up to achieve, at least to a degree, what you have too, and show them what you've learned along the way. And she was, an embodiment of that. And I just had more and more admiration for her as I read more examples of what you're just saying, that the way she did that in life was, was paramount, even as she didn't have the means that we think of. Certainly Roger Federer or anybody else in this day and age who's a great tennis champion, the 500th ranked player in the world made more money than she ever did playing tennis. So, even though she was forgotten and not, given her due, even in her time, perhaps, she still, gave of herself and coached and was forever out there telling people, here's what I learned from my days on and off the court. Apply them to your own life and you can be successful too.
Yeah. So the book is The Divine Miss Marble, and here is information on how you can purchase it. We have it in our shop on Amazon. So I will say, disclaimer, Parenting Aces may get a penny or two if you buy it through this link, but certainly it's available. Huh?
Who deserves it more, right?
I mean, we'll take it, but the link is in the comments as well on this live stream. So if you don't have time to jot it down, if you go to amazon.com/shop/parenting aces, you'll see the book right at the top of the page. And what's next for you, Rob? You mentioned being kind of intrigued by Eleanor Teachten. Is that a next book, maybe?
Well, I mean, I think I did her as much service as I could possibly do in this one, so perhaps I'll let that stand. I don't know if I think I flushed out as much detail about her life as I possibly could. I don't know if there's anything left. Part of what I did in this book was, and I didn't plan on doing it, and we didn't really even get into it very much in this podcast, but I kind of inserted myself into the story a little bit more than I have in my other books, and I plan to do because of sort of the detective work needed. I had a friend of mine who was really into detective novels say to me very early in the process, what I love about the books and mystery novels is not really the plot, but the process of watching somebody, kind of find out the information and see what's true and what's not. So I took that to heart, and I kind of, as I learned, so does the reader learn about all these things about Alice, for good and bad. So to answer the question, that kind of process actually wound up appealing to me. So I don't necessarily have anything I can talk about just yet in terms of the subject, because these things are sort of tenuous. But I think I would like to, at least in part, include myself as part of the story. Not that I'm that interesting, but just in terms of giving the reader something to follow along with and to grasp on to as they read as well. It's kind of appealing. I like to read about stories like that, and I hope certainly wound up liking writing that way. So I'd like to do it again. That would be the case. That would be nice, and that would be another legacy of Alice Marble, a small one, but an important one for me anyway.
There you go. Well, I love that. Again, the book is The Divine Miss Marble. Here's the link if you'd like to purchase a copy. I highly recommend it. It is a fascinating read. You'll learn a ton about tennis. You'll learn a ton about activism. You'll learn about our history during the war. You'll learn about the women's movement. I mean, so much.
There's a lot in there. I tried to. She encompassed, she touched on so many different things that it was great to be able to write about all these different elements. It wasn't just about her. As I said, putting her in context allowed me to write about old Hollywood and about San Francisco of that era and during the Depression and all, and of course the war and post-war era, and the World's Fair she touched on, and various other things that happened.
The gold rush. I mean,
gold rush, absolutely. Yeah.
Her family was involved in that. So, yes.
In California, her paternal grandfather was from Maine, or both her grandparents were from Maine originally, and they wound up moving to California to seek their fortune. And Alice, in her own different way, saw her fortune too, and went east out of California to do so, ironically enough.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, Rob Weintraub, thank you so much for taking time to chat with us. It's been fascinating, and I can't wait to finish the rest of the book. I did my damnedest to get through it before our conversation today, and just didn't happen. But
there's nothing that you can do about it. Don't worry.
Well, it's just so meaty, and I thought, well, I'll just skim through this chapter. I'll skim through, and it's like, no, I can't. There's too much to absorb here. So
devil's in the details.
Exactly. Well, thank you again, and I look forward to your next project whenever that comes about. And if it's tennis related, I hope you'll come back and share it with us.
No question. And if it isn't, I'll be glad to do so anyway.
Perfect. We'd love to have you.
Thanks so much, Lisa. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And to those of you watching, I hope you've enjoyed my conversation with Rob Weintraub about his new book, The Divine Miss Marble. One more time, here's the link if you'd like to purchase a copy. And we'll see you next week. We've got more of these live streams coming. I think we've got one on Monday, and they're just going to keep coming next week. So hope everybody's doing well, and we'll catch you next time on Parenting Aces. Bye, everybody.